The grave was the only thing the wind couldn't bury. Elara watched from the window as snow devoured the fence posts one by one, erasing the hard lines of her world until only the soft, sloping white remained. The sky was the color of a fresh bruise. Inside, the fire ate its ration of wood with a grim appetite, the same way she ate her dwindling stores of jerky and beans. Her husband, John, had promised her this land would be a beginning. He'd neglected to mention it could also be an end. A sound, not the wind, snapped her head toward the door. It was a scraping, a desperate metallic grind from the barn. A bear, maybe, or a wolf, driven mad by hunger. She pulled John's old coat tighter, the scent of him, wood smoke, and earth, a ghost on her shoulders. She grabbed the rifle from its hooks by the door. The cold hit her like a physical blow, stealing the air from her lungs. Each step toward the barn was a pilgrimage through a hostile, alien landscape. The snow was up to her knees, a thick, wet cement that fought her with every move. She shoved the heavy barn door, the frozen wood groaning in protest. The darkness inside was absolute thick, with the smell of hay and cold manure, and something else, something warm and alive. She held her lantern high, its trembling light throwing monstrous shadows against the stalls. Then she saw it. Not a beast, a man! He was huddled against the far wall, a heap of rags and shuddering limbs. His face was a mask of frost and frozen blood, his lips cracked and blue. But it was the thing around his ankle that made her breath catch, a solid band of iron connected to a broken length of chain. A prisoner. His eyes, when they fluttered open, were not wild, but lucid and filled with a terrifying, profound exhaustion. He didn't beg. He didn't threaten. He just watched her, this specter in her sanctuary, and waited for her judgment. He had come to her home to die. The rifle felt impossibly heavy in her hands. He was a criminal. The chain was proof. The law, what little of it reached this far, would demand she turn him in, or leave him for the elements to finish. It was the safe thing to do, the right thing. But the wind howled a counter-argument, a long, mournful cry that sounded like the loneliest thing on earth. She knew that sound. She heard it in her own heart every night. She lowered the rifle. "God help me," she whispered, not to him, but to the unforgiving quiet. She would not let another soul die alone in this endless winter, not on her land. He was heavier than he looked, a dead weight of bone and frozen muscle. Dragging him to the cabin was a brutal, gasping affair. The broken chain snagged on every rock and root hidden beneath the snow, its grating rasp the only sound besides their labored breathing. She laid him on the bearskin rug before the hearth, as close to the fire as she dared. For a long time, he just lay there, a fallen statue thawing into life. The process was violent. Shudders racked his body, his teeth chattering with a sound like stones in a jar. Elara worked with a methodical focus that pushed fear into a corner of her mind. She cut away his stiff, frozen rags with a skinning knife, her movements practical, devoid of emotion. His body was a roadmap of hardship. Old scars crisscrossed his back, fresh gashes marred his arms, and the raw, bloody circle around his ankle where the iron cuff had chafed it to the bone made her stomach clench. He was a young man, younger than John had been, but his face was carved with an ancient weariness. She ladled broth into a bowl and knelt beside him. When she lifted his head, he flinched, a primal instinct of distrust. "Easy," she murmured, the word a puff of steam in the chilled air. "Just broth." She brought the spoon to his lips. He hesitated, his gaze fixed on her face, searching for something she couldn't name. Then he drank. He drank like a man who had forgotten the simple mercy of warmth. He didn't speak, and she didn't ask. The questions hung in the air between them, thick as smoke. Who was he? What had he done? And who was coming for him? For now, the answers didn't matter. What mattered was the rhythm of her care, the gentle cleaning of his wounds, the steady feeding of the fire, the silent company in a world that had felt empty for so long. The shackle was the one thing she could not bring herself to touch. It was a piece of another world, a world of judgment and violence, and it lay cold and heavy on her floorboards, a coiled snake in her home. As the hours passed, the man's shivers subsided, replaced by a deep, unnerving stillness. She watched the slow rise and fall of his chest, a fragile miracle against the howling fury of the storm outside. He was a stray, a wounded animal she had taken in. She told herself she would send him on his way as soon as the storm broke, as soon as he could walk. It was a sensible lie, a balm for her own reckless compassion. But as she watched him sleep in the flickering firelight, his face softened from its harsh, angular desperation. A different truth began to settle in her bones. She had not just brought a man into her home. She had brought the storm inside with her. The storm raged for 3 days. Inside the cabin, a strange, quiet truce took hold. He told her his name was Silas. He said it in a low, rough voice, as if the words were unused to being spoken. He never offered more, and Alara, sensing the fragile perimeter he kept around himself, didn't press. They moved around each other in a careful orbit, their silence punctuated by the necessities of survival. He would watch her split kindling with a quiet intensity, his hands sometimes clenching as if remembering the feel of an axe. She would catch his gaze lingering on the rifle above the door, his expression unreadable. The iron shackle was a constant third presence in the room. He tucked it close to his leg, trying to muffle the clink of the chain when he moved, but the sound was inescapable, a grim punctuation to their shared quiet. On the second day, he was strong enough to sit up. He pointed to the water buckets. "I can," he said, the 2 words a complete sentence. Alara hesitated for a heartbeat, then nodded. It was a risk, a test. She watched as he limped to the buckets, the short length of chain clanking with each step. He carried them back from the door, his movements sure and steady. He didn't look at the unlocked door. He didn't look at the rifle. He just set the water down and returned to his spot by the fire, his duty done. A fragile seed of trust began to sprout in the frozen soil of Alara's fear. That afternoon, the sound of hoofbeats cut through the wind's howl. Alara froze, her hand flying to the windowsill. Silas went rigid, his body coiling like a spring, his eyes darting to the door. It was the posse. It had to be. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced the calm they had built. Silas pushed himself back, trying to shrink into the shadows of the corner. "Get behind the woodpile," she hissed, her voice a strained whisper. He obeyed without question, disappearing behind the neatly stacked logs. The knocking on the door was loud, insistent. Alara took a deep, steadying breath and opened it a crack. It was Jed, their closest neighbor, his face ruddy from the cold, his beard caked with ice. "Elara, just checking on you," he shouted over the wind. "Saw the extra smoke. Figured you were burning through your woodpile faster than usual." Relief and a fresh wave of terror warred within her. "Just fighting the cold, Jed. It's a mean one." "That it is," he agreed, his eyes trying to peer past her into the cabin's warmth. "You need anything? My boys and I are heading to town once this blows over." "I'm fine," she said, forcing a smile that felt brittle on her face. "Thank you for checking." He nodded, satisfied, and turned back to his horse. "Stay warm now." She closed the door, her back pressing against it, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. From behind the woodpile, Silas emerged, his face pale. They looked at each other, the unspoken reality hanging between them. The smoke had been a signal, a beacon. They had been seen. The reprieve was over. The world was coming for them. The storm broke on the fourth day, leaving behind a world of blinding white and crystalline silence. The beauty of it felt like a mockery. Alara knew the thaw meant the roads would be passable, that the quiet would soon be broken by the sound of men and horses. Every snap of a frozen branch, every cry of a distant bird sent a jolt of anxiety through her. She found Silas by the window, staring out at the vast, unbroken snowfield. He had John's old whetstone in his hand, and he was sharpening her dullest kitchen knife with slow, deliberate strokes. The rhythmic scrape of steel on stone was a meditative, unnerving sound. It was the sound of preparation. "They'll come today," he said, not a question. "Yes," she replied, her voice flat. She had spent the night wrestling with her conscience. The sensible part of her screamed to send him away, to point him toward the mountains and save herself. Let him take his chances. He was not her burden. But every time she resolved to do it, the image of him half frozen in her barn rose in her mind. And she thought of Jed's casual observation about the smoke, a small town's innocent curiosity that could become a death sentence. To send him out now would be to condemn him. "You should go," she said, the words tasting like ash, "before they get here." He stopped sharpening the knife. He looked at it, then placed it carefully on the table. He turned to face her, his gaze direct, unwavering. "And where would I go, Alara?" The way he said her name, for the first time, sent a strange shiver through her. The mountains, west. It was a fool's hope, and they both knew it. He gave a short, bitter laugh, a sound with no humor in it. With this, he gestured to the iron on his ankle. "I wouldn't make it a mile. They'd find my body come spring." He was right. Her suggestion was not an offer of freedom, but a cleaner, more distant form of execution. Before she could answer, the sound they had been dreading finally arrived, distant at first, then growing steadily closer. The rhythmic thud of horses moving at a determined pace. Not one rider, but several. Silas's face became a stony mask. He looked at the rifle on the wall, then at her. The unspoken question was plain. What now? There was no time to run, no place to hide. The cabin was a trap. The posse was here. Alara walked to the door, her movements feeling slow, surreal. She could see them now, dark figures against the white snow, led by a man with a silver star pinned to his thick wool coat. Sheriff Thorne. His face was hard, set in a mask of grim authority. He was not a man who listened to excuses. He was a man who dealt in absolutes, in the cold calculus of the law. He reined in his horse 10 yards from her porch, his men fanning out behind him, their expressions a mixture of grim duty and cruel anticipation. They looked like wolves circling a cornered doe. And she was standing in their way. Sheriff Thorne dismounted, his boots sinking into the deep snow. He didn't bother with pleasantries. His eyes, small and dark like beads of obsidian, swept over her, then past her to the cabin door. "Alara," he said, his voice as sharp and cold as the air. "Jedediah Smith said he saw smoke from your chimney." "A lot of it." "It's been a cold week, Sheriff," she said, keeping her voice even, though her heart hammered against her ribs. "My husband left me a good supply of wood. I intend to use it." Thorne's lips twisted into something that wasn't a smile. "We're tracking a fugitive. Escaped a prison transport 2 counties over during the storm. Name of Silas Kane. Killed a guard getting away." He let the words hang in the air, heavy and poisonous. "He's dangerous. We have reason to believe he came this way." Behind him, his men shifted, their hands resting on the butts of their pistols. They weren't here to ask, they were here to take. "I haven't seen anyone," Alara lied, the words feeling foreign and clumsy in her mouth. She stood her ground, her small frame blocking the doorway, a fragile barrier against their certainty. Thorn took a step closer, invading her space. He was a large man, radiating an aura of casual menace. "I've known you a long time, Alara. Knew John. He was a good man, an honest man. Don't make his widow a liar." He tried to peer over her shoulder, his gaze sweeping the interior of the cabin. "I'm going to have to search your property. For your own safety, of course." He reached out, his gloved hand intending to brush her aside. It was a gesture of dismissal, of absolute power. He didn't see her as a person, but as an obstacle. Just as his hand was about to touch her shoulder, a voice came from the shadows within the cabin. "Leave her be." The voice was low, steady, and utterly commanding. Silas stepped out of the darkness and into the doorway beside Alara. He moved with a limp, the chain on his ankle clinking softly on the floorboards, but he stood tall. He positioned himself slightly in front of her, a shield. His face was calm, his eyes locked on Thorn with an unnerving intensity. The posse fell silent. Their confident smirks vanished, replaced by shock, then a simmering rage. They had their man. But this was not the scene they had expected. They had expected to find him cornered, desperate, hiding like a rat. They found him standing guard. Thorn's hand dropped, his face flushed with fury. "Kane," he spat, "get away from her." Silas didn't move. He didn't even blink. His focus was entirely on the sheriff. He spoke again, his words clear and ringing in the cold, still air, a vow that would change everything. "I won't leave her. What would you do? When the law looks like tyranny and the outlaw looks like a protector, where does your allegiance lie?" Sheriff Thorne's face hardened into a mask of pure fury. The moment of shock passed, replaced by the righteous anger of a man whose authority had been challenged. "He's bewitched you, Alara!" Thorne snarled, his accusation directed at her, but his eyes still locked on Silas. "This man is a murderer, a thief. He broke out of a federal transport after slitting a guard's throat for a set of keys." He gestured to his men. "We followed his trail from the wreckage. He left 2 other men for dead. This isn't a man, he's an animal." Each word was a stone thrown, meant to build a wall of fear and revulsion between her and Silas. Alara looked from Thorne's contorted face to the man standing beside her. Silas's expression remained unchanged. He did not deny the charges. He did not plead. He simply stood, a bulwark against the sheriff's venom. The silence stretched, thin and taut. The posse watched her, their faces a collective mask of judgment. In their eyes, she was no longer one of them. She was a fool, a traitor, a woman consorting with a monster. They were waiting for her to step aside, to renounce the creature she had harbored and return to the fold of law and order. Her entire life had taught her to respect the star on Thorne's chest, to believe in the simple binary of good and evil, lawful and criminal. But the man Thorne described, a vicious, desperate animal, was not the man who had carried her water buckets, who had sharpened her knife with quiet patience, who now stood ready to face a dozen guns for her. She saw the story Thorne was telling, and she saw the man standing next to her, and the two did not align. Her gaze met Silas's. In his eyes, she saw no malice. She saw weariness, yes, and a grim resolve. But she also saw a flicker of something else, something she recognized from the long night staring into her own fire. The fierce, stubborn will to simply endure. It was a choice, she realized. Not between law and chaos, but between 2 stories. Thorne's story, shouted with the confidence of power, and Silas's story, told in the silent language of action. She made her choice. She took a small step to the side, not to move away from Silas, but to stand more squarely with him. She raised her chin and met Sheriff Thorne's glare, Her voice, when it came, did not tremble. He stays. The words were a quiet declaration of war. A gasp went through the posse. Thorn looked as if she had slapped him. Alara, so help me God, if you obstruct justice, I will arrest you right alongside him. This is my property, Sheriff, she said, her voice gaining strength. You don't have a warrant to be here, and you surely don't have one to take a man from my home without cause. Cause? Thorn laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. The chain on his leg is all the cause I need. He drew his pistol, the click of the hammer being cocked, echoing in the silence. Last chance, Kane. Step out, or we come in. Silas glanced at Alara, a silent question in his eyes. She gave a faint, almost imperceptible nod. He had stood for her. Now, she would stand for him. You'll have to, Silas said, his voice calm. Because I'm not leaving her to you. Thorn's bluff had been called. For a long, tense moment, it seemed violence was inevitable. The men behind him shifted their weight, their fingers twitching near their triggers. But Thorn was a bully, not a fool. Firing on an unarmed woman on her own property, even one harboring a fugitive, was a line even he was hesitant to cross in broad daylight. The story of it would get twisted. With a curse, he lowered his pistol. Fine, he spat, his voice thick with menace. Have it your way, but don't think this is over. He turned to his men. We'll camp at the edge of her property line. He can't stay in there forever. He'll need food, water. He'll make a mistake. And when he does, we'll be waiting. He locked eyes with Alara one last time. And you, madam, will have a lot to answer for. He mounted his horse and led his men away, their dark shapes retreating across the snow. They didn't go far, setting up a crude camp just within sight of the cabin, a constant, grim reminder of their siege. The immediate threat was gone, but the cabin, once her sanctuary, had officially become their prison. Alara bolted the door and leaned against it, her body finally succumbing to the tremors she'd been holding back. Silas watched her, his expression softening. You shouldn't have done that, he said quietly. He's right. They'll wait. I've only brought you trouble. You didn't bring it, she countered, her voice shaky but firm. It was already here. It was just quieter before. They sat in silence for a long time, the fire crackling in the hearth, the armed camp, a dark promise on the horizon. The weight of her decision settled upon her. She had defied the law, her neighbors, and the only community she had ever known, all for a man she didn't know, a man branded a killer. She had to know. Did you do it? She asked, the question falling into the quiet space between them. Did you kill that guard? Silas stared into the flames, his profile etched by the flickering light. He was silent for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was a low, weary rumble. No. He turned to look at her, his eyes holding hers. But I know who did, the same man who put this chain on my ankle. And then the story spilled out of him, not in a rush, but in a slow, painful torrent. He hadn't been a prisoner on that transport. He'd been a witness. He was a bookkeeper for a wealthy landowner named Marcus Thorn, the sheriff's brother. Silas had discovered a secret ledger, one that detailed years of Marcus's graft, stealing supplies from government contracts, cheating local ranchers on land sales, paying off officials. The guard who died wasn't a guard. He was one of Marcus's hired thugs, sent to silence Silas permanently. The breakout was a staged accident, a way to get rid of Silas and brand him a murderer in the process. The ledger, Silas said, his voice barely a whisper. It proves everything. My innocence, Marcus's guilt, the sheriff's complicity. He knows his brother is a crook. Where is it? Alara asked, leaning forward. He keeps it in a safe in his study, in his house, right in the center of town. He looked at her, his expression bleak. It might as well be on the moon. The truth was worse than she could have imagined. This wasn't about one escaped criminal. It was about a sickness that had taken root in the heart of their community, a corruption that wore the smiling face of prosperity and the badge of the law. And now, she and Silas were trapped, with the proof of their salvation sitting in the lion's den. The siege settled into a grim routine. Days were a tense quiet, nights a canvas for fear. The dark shapes of Thorne's men were always visible by their campfire, a constant, smoldering threat. The cabin grew smaller every day. The walls seemed to press in, the windows like accusing eyes. But within that confinement, something shifted between Alara and Silas. The shared danger, the forced intimacy, burned away the last of their distrust. They were no longer a woman and a prisoner. They were partners in a desperate gamble. One evening, as Alara was mending a tear in John's old coat, Silas spoke from the shadows. He was a good man, your husband. It wasn't a question. Alara's needle paused. He was. He believed in this land. He said it was honest dirt, that it wouldn't lie to you. A sad smile touched her lips. Turns out the dirt is honest. It's the people on it you have to watch out for. Silas nodded, understanding. The ledger is in a floor safe, hidden under a bearskin rug in his study. The same kind of rug you have. He looked at the one by her hearth. Marcus Thorne likes to display his wealth. He's arrogant. He believes he's untouchable. And maybe he is, Alara said, the hope in her feeling thin and fragile. How can we possibly get to it? For days, they talked. They planned. They argued. They paced the small cabin like caged animals, their minds racing far beyond the walls. Silas knew the layout of the house, the habits of Marcus Thorne. Alara knew the town, the back alleys, the patterns of the people who lived there. She knew which dog barked at strangers and which gate had a broken latch. Slowly, piece by piece, a plan began to form. It was a mad plan, built on timing, deception, and a suicidal amount of courage. The winter, their jailer, would have to become their accomplice. There's a new moon in 2 nights, Alara said, looking at an old almanac. And the forecast from Jed's visit, he mentioned another blizzard moving in, a bad one. Silas looked at her, his eyes gleaming with a sudden, fierce light. Cover. The storm would be our cover. The plan was this. Under the cloak of the blizzard and the new moon's darkness, Alara would ride to town. Not to the Thorne house, but to the old, abandoned chapel at the edge of the settlement. She would light a fire in its hearth. In a blizzard, a strange fire would be an alarm. It would be seen as a signal, or a sign of squatters, or a fire getting out of control. It would draw the attention of the town watch, and, with any luck, Sheriff Thorne and his bored, cold men. While they were distracted, Silas, freed from his shackle, would slip into town from the other direction and break into the house. Freed? Silas asked, looking down at the heavy iron cuff. How? Alara stood and walked to the forge in the corner of the barn, a place she hadn't touched since John's death. She picked up a heavy hammer and a chisel. My husband was a blacksmith before he was a rancher, she said, her voice filled with a resolve that surprised even herself. He taught me a few things. The plan was insane. 1,000 things could go wrong. But as she stood there, the weight of the hammer in her hand, she felt a surge of purpose she hadn't felt in years. She was no longer just surviving the winter. She was fighting back. The blizzard arrived, as promised. A furious, swirling vortex of white. It was a monster, but it was their monster. As darkness fell, Alara worked at the forge, the rhythmic clang of hammer on chisel, a defiant heartbeat against the storm's roar. The air filled with the scent of hot metal and exertion. Silas stood nearby, his leg braced on the anvil, his face illuminated by the forge's glow. He never flinched, not even when the chisel sent sparks flying close to his skin. He just watched her, his expression a mixture of awe and gratitude. Finally, with a sharp crack, the iron ring broke. It fell to the dirt floor with a dull thud, leaving a raw, bruised circle on his ankle. For a moment, he just stood there, flexing his foot, as if rediscovering a long-lost freedom. He looked at Alara, his eyes conveying a thanks more profound than any words. There was no time for sentiment. Ilara pulled on John's heaviest coat, saddled her horse, and wrapped a thick scarf around her face. "The chapel fire should give you an hour, maybe more if the storm is bad enough," she said, her voice tight. "Don't be a hero, Silas. Get the ledger and get out. Meet me at the old cottonwood by the creek." He gripped her arm, his touch firm and steadying. "Be careful, Ilara." "You too," she whispered. Then she was gone, a ghost disappearing into the white chaos. The ride to town was a battle against the elements. The wind screamed, and the snow flew so thick she couldn't see 10 feet in front of her. She trusted the horse, letting it pick its way along the barely visible trail. She reached the abandoned chapel, its steeple a dark spike against the gray, churning sky. Inside, it was colder than the grave. With numb fingers, she built a fire in the dilapidated stone hearth, piling on dry wood she'd brought in her saddlebags. Soon, a healthy blaze roared up the chimney, sending a plume of thick smoke into the blizzard. Her part was done. Meanwhile, Silas moved through the town's deserted back alleys like a phantom. The storm had driven everyone indoors. The world was his. He reached the Thorn estate, a large, ostentatious house that radiated a smug sense of security. Just as he'd told Alara, the back gate's latch was rusted through. He slipped into the yard, silent as the falling snow. The study window was dark. He used the knife Alara had sharpened to pry the lock, the wood groaning softly in protest. He slid inside, his heart pounding. The room was just as he remembered. Rich leather chairs, shelves of unread books, and in the center, a massive bearskin rug. He pulled it back. There it was. A small, square iron plate, flush with the floorboards. The safe. He began to work on the combination, his fingers numb with cold and adrenaline. The numbers came back to him, a bitter memory. 32, 18, 4. A click. He pulled the heavy door open. Inside, nestled among stacks of cash, was a thin, leather-bound ledger. He grabbed it. He was just about to close the safe when he heard footsteps in the hall. Heavy, deliberate footsteps. The front door opened and closed. A man's voice, slurred with drink, cursed the storm. It was Marcus Thorne. He had come home early. Silas froze, the ledger clutched in his hand. The study door creaked open, and Marcus Thorne stumbled in, shaking snow from his fine coat. He was a portly man with a florid face, and the arrogant posture of someone who had never been told no. He hadn't seen Silas yet, his back turned as he moved toward a liquor decanter. This was the moment everything could collapse. Silas had two choices: flee and be seen, or confront him. He glanced at the heavy iron poker resting by the fireplace. Before he could move, a second figure appeared in the doorway. Sheriff Thorne. "Brother," the sheriff said, his voice tight with irritation, "what are you doing back from the saloon? The whole town's in an uproar about a fire at the old chapel. I've got my men riding out there in this mess." Marcus waved a dismissive hand. "Let them ride. I've no interest in chasing ghosts in a blizzard. Pour yourself a drink, Clayton. You look frozen." As Sheriff Thorne stepped fully into the room, his eyes adjusted to the dim light. They widened, first in disbelief, then in pure animal fury. His gaze fell on Silas, standing in the heart of the room, the open safe at his feet, the ledger in his hand. "You," Thorne breathed, his hand instinctively going to his gun. Marcus spun around, his drunken confusion turning to shock. "Kane! How in God's name?" Silas didn't flinch. He held up the ledger. "It's over, Marcus. It's all in here. The land grabs, the government payroll you skimmed, the men you paid to have me killed." "Lies," Marcus blustered, but his face was pale, his eyes darting nervously toward his brother. Sheriff Thorne drew his pistol, the movement fast and practiced. "Drop it, Kane. Drop it now, and I might just arrest you instead of shooting you where you stand for breaking into my brother's home." "And what will you tell everyone, Sheriff?" Silas countered, his voice steady and clear, ringing with the authority of truth. "That you found me with the book that proves you've been your brother's dog your entire life? That you helped him cover up a murder?" The sheriff's face contorted, the conflict raging within him. At that exact moment, the study's window shattered inward, and Alara tumbled through, a rifle in her hands. She had waited at the creek, but when the blizzard worsened and Silas didn't appear, a terrible premonition had seized her. She'd circled back. Seeing the lights and horses, she'd gambled everything on one last, desperate act. She leveled the rifle at the sheriff. "Drop your gun, Clayton," she ordered, her voice shaking but resolute. The room was a tableau of imminent violence. 4 people, 2 guns, and 1 book that held all their futures. Marcus, desperate, made a lunge for Silas. "Give me that book, you lying son of a bitch!" It was the wrong move. As he lunged, Silas sidestepped, raising the heavy leather ledger and bringing it down with all his force on the side of Marcus's head. Marcus crumpled to the floor, unconscious. Sheriff Thorne, his devotion to his brother overriding his self-preservation, swung his pistol toward Silas. Before he could fire, Alara's rifle roared, the sound deafening in the enclosed space. The shot was true, not to kill, but to disarm. The bullet tore through Thorne's wrist, sending his pistol clattering to the floor. He screamed, clutching his shattered hand, his face a mask of agony and defeat. It was over. The aftermath was quiet, the way only the world after a blizzard can be. News of the Thorne brothers' crimes, laid bare by the ledger, swept through the town like a slow, cleansing fire. The initial shock gave way to a grudging reevaluation. People looked at each other differently, questioning the comfortable certainties they had lived by. A federal marshal arrived, drawn by the intersecting reports of a prison break, a murder, and massive corruption. He listened patiently to Silas's story, his sharp eyes examining the detailed entries in the ledger. Silas Kane was exonerated, his name cleared. Marcus Thorne was arrested, his empire of deceit crumbling into dust. Sheriff Clayton Thorne, disgraced and wounded, was stripped of his star and faced his own trial for obstruction and conspiracy. The town, in its clumsy way, tried to make amends. Neighbors left baskets of bread and salted meat on Alara's porch. Jedediah Smith came by, hat in hand, and offered a sincere, shame-faced apology. "We were wrong about him, Alara. About you. We're sorry." Alara accepted their offerings and their apologies with a quiet grace, but something inside her had irrevocably changed. She no longer saw the town as a sanctuary, but as a place of fickle loyalties and hidden darkness. Her allegiance was no longer to the community, but to the small patch of land John had loved, and to the man who had shown her its true value. Spring came late that year, but when it did, it came with a fierce, beautiful intensity. The snow melted away, revealing the rich, dark earth beneath. The creek, frozen for months, began to flow again with a joyful, burbling sound. The world was being reborn. One afternoon, Alara and Silas stood on the porch, watching the last vestiges of winter retreat into the high peaks of the mountains. The air was soft, carrying the scent of damp earth and new life. Silas was no longer a prisoner, no longer a fugitive. He was just a man. He had offers to go elsewhere, to start over in a place where his name wasn't tied to scandal, but he hadn't left. "The land is waking up," Ilara said softly. "It's honest dirt," Silas replied, echoing her own words back to her. He looked at her, his gaze clear and steady. The weariness was still there, but it was overshadowed by a quiet, resilient hope. A person could build a life on land like this. It wasn't a proposal, not yet. It was something simpler, and perhaps more profound. It was a recognition. They were two solitary souls who had found each other in the heart of a storm. They had been tested, broken, and remade. They had survived the winter together. The ending to their story hadn't been written yet, but for the first time in a long time, as they stood side by side under the vast open sky, it felt like the first page of a new chapter, one they would write themselves.